Welcome to another video tutorial. In this one, we'll go through how we can do a dynamic pivot in Snowflake and how we can set up a stored procedure to do dynamic pivots in Snowflake. So first I'll just do a review of what a pivot is and what a dynamic pivot is. And basically a pivot is if we had a table like this in Snowflake that you can see behind me with 4 columns, city, year, category and value. And if I wanted to change the layout of that table, so instead of having category as a column, I want these values in the category columns to become columns themselves. And then what fills in those columns will come from the value column. So I'll run a pivot query so you can see what I mean. Table looks kind of similar to the table we had before. We still have the city and year column, but instead of having a category column, the entries in that column are now columns themselves, and the numbers come from that value column, which has also disappeared. So it's just a different way of looking at the same data. There's also only unique pairs of city and year, so if there was more than one number for the same city and year, those numbers would be summed. That's also something you have control over doing a pivot. So this up here is query I ran to do a pivot, and you can see we sum values for the city and year. The table that I pivoted is just the table that you saw in the first version, and the categories, the category column, we've selected a few of the values within the category column. And this list I've actually written out so it's only values in the category column that contain the letter A. So I'll go back to my example table actually. So you can see I only wanted values in this category column with the letter A to become new columns in the pivoted table. So ones like B, C don't actually get a new column. And so the way I've done that is just had a look through the values in my category column to see which ones contain the letter A. I've written them out here. So that's how we do a pivot in Snowflake. What a dynamic pivot would be is if we were able to pick out the values in the category column that contain the letter A without having to look through and find them ourselves. We'd use something like Snowflake's where function, like where category contains A. So the pivot function doesn't allow you to do that the way that it is set up, so we had to figure out a different way to do it. And this is actually the second video on dynamic pivoting on the channel. The first one, we basically set this query up as a string or a set of strings that we combine together, and that kind of gave us control over what the string was made up of. So we could do something like Snowflake's where function where we filter our category column, turn that result into a string, combine the strings together and run the string as a query. And that works quite well, except that Snowflake can't store a string, I think, longer than 256 characters. So, and you hit that pretty quickly. So if you've got a few columns that you want to pivot, then you'll probably exceed that 256 characters. So in the second video, we'll do it in a way where we don't run into that trouble, where we can write a query that can form a string together longer than 256 characters. And as an end result, as a kind of final thing, we want to make that stored procedure for doing a dynamic pivot. And stored procedure is something that looks like this, the next lines down. I've made the stored procedure called dynamic pivot, so it can be called using call, and it basically takes a set of inputs, and these inputs are basically what is going to change each time I want to do a dynamic pivot. So starting from the bottom, sum would be this part of the dynamic pivot. Value is the column that I want to make up the values for the new table. The category is the name of the column that I actually want to pivot. This is the table that I want to do the dynamic pivot on, and this is my kind of dynamic condition of the values in the category column that contain the letter A. So if I run this dynamic pivot procedure, it gives me the same answer as running this here, but this is a bit easier to change. I can change the A to a B, and now when I run it, these columns are going to be values that contain the letter B from the category column. So we'll go through how to write a dynamic pivot query and then how to turn that query into a stored procedure. And so to do that, we're going to be using Snowflake Scripting, which is slightly different to the normal Snowflake SQL. And you write it like this. So I've got the basic structure here. First, this execute immediate executes the script we're about to write. And the script starts and ends between these dollar signs, these double dollar signs. The first thing in the script is this declare part, which is where we declare the variables that we're going to use in our script and what type of variable they are. After that, there's this begin, and that's where the script begins, and we can use those variables that we declared just before. Then we return an output, and then the script ends. So as a really simple example, I can declare a variable called a and make it a string just by writing string. So now in our script we have this variable a, which is available to us. So I can just say that a equals, and we say equals with colon equals, and just a string, maybe testing, and write a semicolon to finish it off, and I can just return a. So we've declared a, we've set a equal to the word testing, and then we've returned it. So if I run this Snowflake script, we'd expect it to return the word testing. And it does, so that's good. And this is the structure that we're basically going to be using to make our dynamic pivot. So I'll bring across a few variables. We're going to use 8 variables in our Snowflake script. The first 5 are actually going to be the same as what I just went through here. So they're what's going to change each time we want to do a dynamic pivot. After these first 5 variables, the rest of the script and the variables will stay the same every time you want to do a dynamic pivot. So if you're running this as a query rather than as a procedure, you'd only have to change these first 5 lines. So I'll enter each one by one, and so with these variables we will give them a value before we start the script, and we can do that using this default. So the pivot function is going to have the default value of sum before we start the script. We'll just go through each of these and basically make them the same as this input for the procedure. Value is going to come next. The column name we want to pivot is category. The table is this whole string here. And the column list is what makes up this list here. So to do that, I'll just bring in the query that I've used. I've written the select statement which selects the distinct categories from the category column in the example table where category contains A. So it's taken that output table and then turned those rows into a list using this listagg function. So that will aggregate those rows into a list and separate those rows with a comma. So I'll hit run on that, and you can see that is looking very similar to what we have in there. So I can put this in as the first input to our script. That's going to be the list that we want to pivot. So these next 3, we're not going to give them any values. Those are going to come into our script. They're going to get values there. And so the first thing that I want to do in the script is make column list in, this one you can see down here, look like it does in the query, because we're basically aiming to recreate this query from these 5 inputs. So it looks pretty similar, which is good, but we can already see this is separated by comma and this is separated by comma, but each value has an apostrophe before it starts and after it finishes. And it starts and ends with a bracket. So those are the things we're going to add in our script. So to start, I'm going to say column selection, which is going to be updated version of column list in, column selection is equal to column list in. So in the first run through, we're not going to make any changes to it. I just want to check that it works. And I'm going to return column selection like that. So give this a run. Whoops. I forgot a couple of things. One thing I forgot is default in here, and I want to put some brackets around this, I believe. Let me check that. Cool. So put some brackets around here because I think it expected after default it thought select was what I was assigning to column list in. Didn't know why I was carrying on to right after I'd already assigned something to this. So putting this in columns, in brackets, means it takes the output from this query. And I just added the default in there. So takes in these variables, sets column selection equal to column list in, and then we're just returning it. So now we can start to add a bit more to column list in to make it look a bit more like this. And the first thing we want to do is add those apostrophes to the start and end of each of the values. I'm going to do that using this regular expression replace function. So this looks for a certain expression and replaces it with another expression. What I want to look for is just a comma. I want to replace a comma with a apostrophe, comma, apostrophe. So it looks more like up here. So that's the second input to replace. And then the third one is what I want to replace it with. And this is tricky because that's what I want to replace it with, but I also have to put this inside apostrophes. And so it doesn't think I'm starting a string here and ending it here, I just have to put a backslash like that. So it's backslash means treat the next thing in the string not as a apostrophe that would end the string, treat it as a normal apostrophe. So I put one there, and if I put one there, just get rid of those spaces that I added. That should be what I want. And then I will end that replace statement. Cool, so that is looking a bit more like we want. Now we have apostrophes at the start and end of each of these. We don't have them at either end, so we'll have to add that in the next step. The way we can just add one string to another string in a Snowflake script is just to do this symbol here. So this string is going to be added to what I write here. And what we want to add is we want a closing bracket. And we also want an apostrophe. So I'm going to put the apostrophe just before the closing bracket. Again, put a backslash in there. If I run that, cool, that's looking good. And we want to do just the same to the other side. So a starting bracket, an apostrophe, and just slash there. Cool, so that is looking good. That's part of this query, and that's the part that is going to be changing each time. So column selection is looking good. I'm going to move on to the next part of the query, which is just going to be writing this whole query out, but every time there's something we want to change, say our table or the pivot function, we substitute in one of these 5 variables. And that is what final SQL is going to be. So final SQL, maybe I'll return final SQL now so we can see how we're going. Set final SQL equal to select all. Just move this down so I can see it. So we start off with select all from, and already we substitute in one of our variables, and that one was called table n. Select all from table in, so it's going to add this part of our query. Combine that to pivot and open bracket, and then combine that with pivot function in. Let's just see how that looks so far. Oops, didn't finish that off. Cool, select all from here, pivots, get in there. Combine that with an open bracket here, followed by a double apostrophe. Combine that with the value, the name of the value column, which is value column name, and then another double apostrophe, closing bracket. So now we're up to I just added that bit, space 4, and then name of our category column, which is pivot column name. So we're up to here, we need this in with a space either side. In, and then, oops. And we just need to add this part, which we made as column selection. So put column selection there. And then we just need to finish it off with a bracket, I believe. Let's give that a go. Select. Cool, that is looking good. Alright, now, so we've got this query as a string that we want to run. The next thing we're going to do is use this output variable. You can see output is not a string, it's a result set. So this is the result of a query. That's the type of variable it is. So this is going to be equal to execute immediate, which executes a query. Final SQL. And then this function, for our return, we're going to return output as a table. So we'll just put table brackets before it. Let's give that a go. Cool, that is looking good. So I can run this now as a query and just change these first 5 lines, and that works well for me, which is good. But I can also make this into a stored procedure, and that's how we make this up here, this procedure that we can call later. So to do that, I just have to write at the top, create or replace procedure, and give it a name, dynamic pivot. I'm just replacing the one that I already made. Then underneath that, write what it returns. So this returns a table. And then write the language, because we have a few different options for languages when we write stored procedures, but this is just in SQL. And so we don't need to execute this now because we're just storing it as a procedure that we can use later. So this would create a stored procedure for us. In these brackets are where we specify what inputs the user needs to give to run the stored procedure. And so now, instead of having these variables defined in the query, we put them up here so the user has the option of changing them when they call the stored procedure. So I'm just going to copy these in and you still need the format, so column list in is a string, table in is a string, pivot column name is a string, oops, merely column name, string, and lastly pivot function in is a string. So now these come in when the procedure is called. They don't need to be defined here. So that should be all that's needed. And if I run that, we have a dynamic pivot successfully created. And so we can call it anytime in this way. So I hope that's been helpful for your dynamic pivoting. Let me know if you've got any questions, add them to the comments. Thanks very much.